Paris is often described as one of the most beautiful cities ever built, a place of elegant boulevards, glowing streetlights, centuries-old architecture, and famous landmarks that have become symbols of culture across the world. Millions of people travel there every year to stand beneath the Eiffel Tower, walk along the banks of the Seine, and wander through streets that seem frozen in time. But beneath that beauty lies something most visitors never think about: a hidden layer of the city. In fact, in some parts of Paris, the ground people walk on today sits several meters above what used to be the original street level centuries ago. Beneath the pavement are forgotten passages, sealed doors, buried windows, and entire architectural levels that once existed in plain sight. For the most part, these layers of the city remain hidden. But in the winter of 1910, something happened that briefly exposed parts of this forgotten world. After weeks of relentless rain across northern France, the Seine River began to rise. At first, the increase in water levels didn't alarm anyone. Seasonal flooding had happened before. The people of Paris were used to the river swelling during heavy rain. But this time, the rain didn't stop. Day after day, the clouds lingered over the region, feeding the river until it became overwhelmed. Tributaries feeding into the Seine also began overflowing, sending even more water toward the capital. Soon, the river could no longer stay within its banks. The Seine began spilling into the streets. Water pushed through drainage systems, flooded underground tunnels, and crept slowly through the lowest areas of the city. What started as minor flooding quickly turned into one of the worst natural disasters Paris had ever seen. By late January, the situation had become catastrophic. Water levels rose more than 8 meters above normal in some areas. Entire neighborhoods became submerged. Streets turned into canals. Train stations filled with water. The growing Paris metro system, which had only recently opened, was suddenly flooded. Electricity failed across parts of the city. Transportation collapsed. Businesses shut down. Photographs from the time show Parisians navigating their own city in small boats. In some areas, people built makeshift wooden walkways between buildings so they could cross the streets without stepping into the water. In other places, shopkeepers continued selling goods through second-story windows while the ground floor remained underwater. It looked less like Paris and more like Venice. The flood didn't destroy the city entirely, but it brought daily life to a halt for weeks. At its peak, nearly 20,000 buildings were affected by water damage. Infrastructure across the capital had been compromised. But once the rain finally stopped and the river slowly began to fall, something unusual started to happen. As workers began pumping water out of flooded tunnels, clearing mud from basements, and repairing the damage left behind by the disaster, they started noticing things that didn't quite make sense. In several areas of the city, the flood had exposed structures that most people didn't know existed. Doorways that opened into soil, stone arches buried beneath street level, windows that sat halfway underground as if the buildings had slowly sunk into the earth, entire lower levels of architecture that seemed disconnected from the modern city above them. Some workers even reported corridors and passages hidden beneath the streets, sealed away and forgotten for decades. To many Parisians, it felt as though the flood had briefly peeled back a layer of the city's past. And in some places, that past appeared far older than expected. This discovery led to a wave of curiosity about what exactly lay beneath the surface of Paris. Historians already knew the city had a long and complicated past, but the flood made people realize just how much of that past had literally been buried. For centuries, Paris had been constantly rebuilding itself. Each generation modified the city, repaired it, expanded it, and sometimes completely reshaped it. Over time, older structures were covered, buried, or incorporated into newer buildings. The result was a city with multiple layers of history stacked on top of each other. But for some observers, the discoveries after the flood raised even more unusual questions. Because many of the buried architectural features seemed far too elaborate to simply be foundations or structural supports. They looked like parts of complete buildings, full floors, entire entrances that once clearly opened directly onto a street level that no longer existed. This idea sparked a curiosity that continues even today. What if modern Paris wasn't built directly on its original ground level? What if the city we see today actually sits on top of an older version of itself? To understand why that possibility exists, it helps to look back much further into the city's history. Long before Paris became the cultural capital of France, it began as a small settlement along the Seine River. More than 2,000 years ago, the area was inhabited by a Celtic tribe known as the Parisians. They built a modest settlement along the banks, using the waterway for trade and transportation. When the Roman Empire expanded into the region, they transformed the settlement into a Roman town called Lutetia. Lutetia was far smaller than modern Paris, but it included the familiar features of Roman urban life: stone streets, bathhouses, public squares, and defensive walls. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of these ancient structures beneath the modern city, including sections of ancient roads and amphitheaters that once hosted public events. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the settlement gradually evolved into medieval Paris. During the Middle Ages, the city grew rapidly, but its infrastructure struggled to keep up with the growing population. Streets were narrow and often muddy. Waste disposal systems were primitive. Flooding along the Seine remained a constant problem. To address these issues, city officials sometimes raised street levels over time. Layers of dirt, gravel, and stone were added to roads to improve drainage and sanitation. When buildings were renovated or replaced, the new structures were often built to match the higher street level. Over decades and centuries, this process slowly buried parts of the older city. Windows became basement openings, ground floors became underground levels. Entire architectural features disappeared beneath new construction. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation of Paris occurred in the 19th century. During the reign of Napoleon III, the French government launched one of the largest urban redevelopment projects in European history. The project was led by a city planner named Baron Eugene Haussmann. At the time, Paris still had many medieval streets that were extremely narrow and overcrowded. Haussmann's mission was to modernize the city. Thousands of old buildings were demolished. Entire neighborhoods were redesigned. Wide boulevards replaced cramped alleyways. Modern sewer systems and infrastructure were installed beneath the streets. The Paris we recognize today, lined with uniform stone buildings and broad avenues, was largely created during this massive reconstruction. But the transformation also buried huge parts of the older city. In some cases, Haussmann's renovations simply built over existing structures rather than removing them completely. Old foundations remained underground, passages were sealed off, windows that once opened directly onto a street level were left below the new ground level. Over time, they faded into obscurity. For most people, these buried spaces remained completely invisible. That is, until the flood of 1910 forced the city to confront what lay beneath its surface. But the hidden structures beneath Paris go even deeper than old street levels and abandoned foundations. Perhaps the most famous underground feature of the city is the vast network known as the Paris Catacombs. These tunnels stretch for hundreds of kilometers beneath the city, forming one of the largest underground networks in the world. Originally, the tunnels were limestone quarries. For centuries, builders in Paris extracted stone from beneath the city to construct buildings above ground. Eventually, the quarry network expanded so much that large portions of the ground beneath Paris were hollowed out. In the late 18th century, city officials faced another problem. Parisian cemeteries had become dangerously overcrowded. Some burial grounds were literally overflowing. In response, authorities decided to relocate the remains of millions of people into the abandoned quarry tunnels beneath the city. Over several years, bones were carefully transferred underground and arranged within the tunnels. Today, the catacombs contain the remains of more than 6 million individuals. While a small portion of the tunnels is open to tourists, the vast majority remains closed to the public. Many sections extend beneath neighborhoods, parks, and major streets. Hidden passages branch off in directions few people have ever explored. The existence of this underground world adds another layer to the mystery of Paris. Because when the floodwaters of 1910 surged through the city's drainage systems and tunnels, they didn't just move through modern infrastructure. They flowed through a labyrinth of historical spaces created across centuries. And as workers repaired damage and cleared debris from those areas, they encountered structures that had long been forgotten.